Hello everybody and welcome again to another webcast from Percipient. Today we're going to be providing a GMP and GDP update. Some of you know my name's David Stokes. I'm Global Lead for Life Sciences with Percipient. I've been in the industry for 30 years now, across various areas of manufacturing supply chain, and with a lot of focus on regulatory compliance and validation. One of the key things I'm involved with is helping Percipient's clients to implement business and manufacturing systems in accordance with both GMP and GDP regulations, and that's what we'll be looking at today. If you'd like to ask any questions during today's session, please just press the Q&A button at the top of the screen. If you type your question in, we should hopefully get a chance to get time today to answer your question while we're on air. If it's complicated and we need to look up the answers, or we run out of time, we'll post those in our blog. If you've got any questions with the logistics or any technical issues, you can use chat on the left-hand side of the screen, and Helen's on hand to help you out there. Okay, so I mentioned we're going to look at GMP, GDP updates and so on today, and just to give some credence to what we're talking about. Last week in London, the UK MHRA had both a GDP and GMP symposium. There were over 1,000 people there over 3 days, and as you'll see, there are quite a number of updates specifically in the area of good distribution practice. That session was run over 2 days, and as I say, over 1,000 people attended, so very good turnout. And to be fair to MHRA, a very well run couple of sessions as well. We're also going to touch on today the US HR 3204, which since the last webcast we had last month has now been enacted, has been signed into law by President Obama. There's a couple of parts of that. One is looking at drug compounding, but the part we're going to be looking at today is on the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. And as we'll see, there are some good opportunities there, which hopefully the regulators will take in terms of aligning those US requirements with what's going on in Europe. So let's jump in, and we'll start looking at changes to good distribution practice in Europe. And before we do that, we should say that for those of you who are actually manufacturers, by definition, of course, you are, if you're selling your product, you're distributing it. So applicable parts of GDP do, of course, apply to manufacturers as well. And we'll try and point those out as we go through today's session. So a lot of this has been driven from the Falsified Medicines Directive, which was passed last year in Europe. That's now been transposed into UK law. It's also been transposed into other European national law, or is in the process of doing so. That's pretty much in place across most of Europe now. In the UK, that's been covered under the statutory instruments. You can see the reference number there. And it's entitled the Human Medicines Amendments Regulations 2013, because it amends the Human Medicines Regulations 2012. It actually came into law back in August, on the 20th of August this year, so it's now part of UK law. And although there are some dates for pending requirements, which still require additional regulations to be made in Europe, certain parts of the new law are already in effect and are actually already being enforced by MHRA in the UK. There's a number of requirements there, which we're going to look at. One of the first things that the amendment looks at is parallel imports. As anybody knows, in our industry, parallel imports, so that's moving product from one, in our case, European country to another, sometimes because of cost differences, sometimes because of supply shortages, has been relatively common, but it's also been a known source of subversion of the supply chain. So that's an area where counterfeited drugs certainly have been thought, and in some cases it's been established, that that's how they've been getting into the supply chain. So Article 76 of that Human Medicines Regulations now requires anybody who is importing drugs from another European country, first of all to pay a fee and to put systems in place to notify here in the UK, the MHRA or the European Medicines Agency, when they're importing products from another European Union member state. And that's really just to keep a track on who's actually being responsible for those parallel imports. There was a move during consultation of the Falsified Medicines Directive to really try and clamp down on repackaging and parallel imports. But really what's happened now is, as you'll see later, there's been a much greater move to just force people to register with various import activities, distribution activities, and so on. Somebody said last week that really the GDP requirements are more revolution than evolution. And there are quite a few changes which we'll run through. Article 80 of that regulation now requires wholesale distributors to have a full quality system in place. Now, for those of you who are manufacturers and who obviously are distributing your products, you will already have the requirements of that quality system in place. It requires you to have a full quality system, change control processes in place, CAPA processes in place, and so on. And while that's not a big change for anybody who's been involved in GMP, that's going to be a significant change, certainly to smaller wholesale distributors. Many of the large organisations obviously already have these in place. But there are a lot of relatively small or specialist wholesale distributors who, although have good practices in place, don't have those formalised as part of a quality management system. So that's going to be a big change for a number of organisations. There's also a requirement so that if anybody either receives or is offered what they suspect or they can prove to be a falsified or counterfeited medicinal product, they have to both make that to the competent authorities, so MHRA or EMA, but also to the holder of the marketing authorisation. That's largely going to apply obviously to distributors, but if you're a manufacturer who's possibly combining your products with products from another manufacturer, and you receive products which you suspect are counterfeit, then you also have that requirement to report that to the authorities and to the marketing authorisation holder. And that pretty much is in effect right away. Article 80 also requires that we have active verification of our supply chain partners. So essentially, there is a requirement that any supplier of a medicinal drug or a human medicinal drug has to comply with GDP, and they will need to hold a wholesale distribution licence. So anybody who is taking product from a distributor, could be another manufacturer, could be another wholesale distributor, will need to take active steps to verify that the distributor they're getting the product from is licensed, and also if it's coming directly from a manufacturer or an importer, that they have an appropriate manufacturing authorisation. There are also controls in place to make sure that any brokers, that's individuals or organisations who are brokering a deal between two organisations, typically for a fee, they have to be registered as well. So there's going to be this requirement, essentially, that certainly your upstream supply chain partners are actively verified, and you will be responsible for checking that they have that distribution licence. And you can either ask to see that, or as we'll see in a while, there will be a database which will allow people to verify that, and that will be on a European basis. There are also requirements on so-called import for export. These really have made some amendments. So Article 85A of the EU Directive GMP and also the Pharmacovigilance Directive now requires that if you are importing products into Europe solely for export, so you're not placing it in sale in the European Union, you need to check, first of all, the people you are buying that product from, comply with appropriate GMP, and the people that you're selling it on to are authorised in their country, in their third-party country, to distribute that product or to supply it by way of retail. Now, those requirements came into effect back in October, and although there are relatively few companies who specialise in that, again, there may be instances where you're exporting product from the UK or elsewhere in the European Union, you're selling it outside of the EU, and you may also be combining it with other products which you're importing from outside the European Union. And again, you need to be appropriately registered for those requirements, and you need to be checking your upstream supplier of product to make sure that they are authorised to supply medicinal products, and the people that you're selling to are authorised to distribute. Now, obviously, that means you're going to have a reasonable idea of how these third parties are authorised. So if you're importing from a manufacturer in China and you're selling to a distributor in Brazil, you're going to need to understand how those organisations are authorised in those countries. So quite a requirement there if you're buying into and then selling out of the EU, again, without putting those products on the market within the European Union. So we have new GDP guidelines. The old guidelines used to be 4 pages, 34 paragraphs, and I think they only used the word must in one of those paragraphs. You had to, there was a must with respect to including a delivery note in the shipment. The new GDP guidance is quite a lot longer, 14 pages, 10 chapters now, and you can see a link there to those new GDP guidelines. Now, a lot of that obviously does apply solely to distributors, but as we've said, if you're a manufacturer and obviously you're distributing your own products, you're going to have to comply with the relevant parts of GDP as well, and that will need to be included in your authorisation. Now, interestingly, the MHRA shared last week that they've already conducted a significant number of inspections against those new GDP guidelines, and by the end of this year, so that's a period of just about 4 months, they'll have conducted over 450 inspections against those new GDP guidelines. So if you're a distributor, you should be aware MHRA are significantly increasing their number of GDP inspectors, and again, you will also need to be complying with these requirements as a manufacturer who distributes your own product. And really, there's a bit of a change in emphasis. So whereas in the past there was a lot of focus from the GDP inspectors telling distributors, and in some cases manufacturers, what the GDP requirements were and how to interpret them, MHRA are now going to change focus. So the focus is going to be on making sure that there is an appropriate risk-based quality management system in place, and that is working effectively. Now, for small organisations, that's not going to be a problem. That's already in place, possibly as part of the GMP activities. But for a lot of wholesale distributors, formalising that quality management system is going to be a significant change. And there was emphasis last week that the quality management system needs to cover people, processes, equipment, but also IT systems, which is something we've been seeing at Percipient, an increasing trend over the last few years. People are becoming more reliant upon their IT systems, and certainly there's an expectation now that they will be appropriately validated. So as we've said, in the GMP area, over the last, 5 years, we've been moving much more towards a risk-based quality management system approach. So it'll be more a case of ensuring that is, tailored to cover distribution activities. But for a lot of smaller distributors, that's going to be quite a significant change in approach in the way they go about their operations. Other areas of focus that were mentioned around GDP is qualification of upstream suppliers. There is going to be a new, what's going to be called the GMDP database. So that will list all of the manufacturers or distributors in Europe. MHRA will have responsibility for collecting that information in the UK and passing that on to the European database, as would all the other EU member states. So you will need to make sure that your suppliers are either included in that database or in the short term, obviously it will take a while for that database to be populated, you need to make sure that there is evidence of a satisfactory inspection. So if you've got any upstream distribution partners, they should have had a GDP inspection and they should have had a closeout letter at the end of that inspection, and you should see a copy of that if they're not yet in the database. More focus on transportation of human medicines as well. I guess not surprisingly, we were expecting this. Transportation must now occur within acceptable limits. So whatever the the temperature, acceptable storage temperature is on your outer packaging of your product, that is the temperature with which it must be transported. And you'll no longer be allowed to use stability data to verify the fact that you are not doing your temperature mapping during storage and transportation. Some clarification around separation and segregation of products. So physical separation is still going to be required in defined circumstances. So there are certain products that need to be physically segregated because of the possibility and the severity of cross-contamination and issues with human health. If you have returned products or falsified products, for instance, that will still need to be stored separately in a physical sense. But electronic segregation, there's been clarification that now is allowed, but that must be used and based on the use of validated systems. So wherever you are in the distribution chain, if your inventory management in your warehouse, and that includes obviously your outbound shipping warehouse as a manufacturer, if you're managing inventory there using a computerized system, you can segregate based upon status. Well, the company's already doing that, but those systems and that functionality must be validated. So a lot of things going on there in the world of GDP. Really just covered the highlights, and certainly would recommend people to take a look at that new GDP guidance document if you haven't already done so, so that you can understand which parts are applicable to you, either as a manufacturer or a wholesale distributor, and make sure you're complying with the requirements there. Fewer actual changes in the area of GMP, which we'll look at, but quite a few things are coming along. So we were lucky. We had David Cockburn from EMA speaking last week, and he talked about the Falsified Medicines Directive, and the EMA see that as there being 4 pillars which will help address issues around falsified medicines. First of all, safety features. So that's partly to do with tamper-proof packaging. And essentially it's up to manufacturers to identify for themselves the need based upon risk for the use of appropriate tamper-proof packaging, but also to make sure that the consumer level packaging is uniquely identifiable, which we'll talk about in a while in the context of changes in the US. We've already talked about good distribution practices, so a lot of tightening up there, which we've mentioned. Some controls around active substances, APIs, which we'll touch on, and also the issue of internet sales, which we'll mention in just a second. So the Falsified Medicines Directive came into force, see there, beginning of the year, and the provisions on the controlling the import of active substances, APIs, have actually been enforced since the summer in July. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those are and what the appropriate controls are for importing APIs in a second. We'll also pick up safety features in a second, but there's a bit of misunderstanding around its use of the Internet logo. Some people are just seeing it that authorised sales outlets on the Internet will just have a logo that appears in the corner of the website. it's actually much more technical than that. If you are selling on the internet, essentially you will need to be, again, registered. And clicking on this logo will not just, show a pretty picture. It will actually allow people to check that your internet sales, your internet pharmacy, is actually registered and complies with the various requirements of the Falsified Medicines Directive. They still have to develop the technical standards for how that will work. That will be in a delegated act which the European Commission will draw up. So again, if you work for a manufacturer who may sell your own products via the internet, that's something to be aware of. And again, that's very much to address the issue and the fact that the majority of counterfeit drugs in the supply chain are actually sold through online so-called internet pharmacies. So looking at APIs for a moment, manufacturers of APIs in the European Union, but also importers and distributors of active substances will now also have to be registered. They'll have to be on this database. And there's a requirement for the manufacturing authorization holder to do two things. One is to audit or to have audited their API manufacturers and distributors. So you don't actually have to do the audit yourself in all circumstances. You can rely on an audit by a third party. But you also need to submit a written statement to the competent authorities confirming that your API is manufactured in accordance with GMP. Now, if that's outside of Europe, that is really equivalent GMP. And for those purposes, they are considering, not surprisingly, that ICH-Q7 or the World Health Organization GMP guidelines for APIs will be treated as equivalent. So you need to check that your API manufacturer is either within Europe and is registered and following EU GMP for APIs, or if they're outside Europe, that they're complying with ICH-Q7 or WHO guidelines. It is possible to import APIs, and I'm talking about importing into the EU here, not the UK, but you can import them from so-called whitelisted countries where the regulations and the regulatory process has been deemed to be equivalent to that of the EU. Now, it's up to those third-party countries to be whitelisted. So far, Australia, Japan, Switzerland and the US have been added to that list of countries you can import from without restriction. And you can see there other countries, Argentina, Brazil, Israel, Malaysia, New Zealand, Singapore, are in the progress of requesting to go on that list. And in some cases they're having to change some of their own legislation to comply with that. But the reality is those countries probably don't cover a lot or the majority of our APIs. A lot of it's coming from India and China. And they're going down another route, which is basically to provide a written statement for any particular API manufacturer that they comply with GMP. Now, both the Indian and Chinese regulators have said that they will provide those written statements for appropriate manufacturers of APIs, but the Chinese have said that they cannot guarantee that they will supply that for every manufacturer of API in China. They know that there are rogue manufacturers in China. And the third route in which you may be allowed to import an API into Europe is if there is a specific need, a drug shortage, and under those circumstances it will be possible to import if there is a EEA, that's the EC, or the European Economic Area regulatory authorities, if they have conducted an inspection and said that it's okay, or an inspection is scheduled, you will be allowed to import the product. You won't be able to use the product until the inspection has actually taken place. But that really is by exception, and that's to address drug shortages. So bottom line is, in most circumstances, if you're importing APIs from outside the EU, it'll either have to be from one of those whitelisted countries, you'll have to have done your audit, and confirm compliance with appropriate GMP, or you will need a written statement from the regulator saying that that company complies with GMP. One other change to GMP which has taken place, which is looking at the whole issue of qualification and verification of suppliers. This really places the emphasis on the manufacturer to really be able to demonstrate that they know exactly what has gone into each batch of product. That includes not only your APIs, but any starting materials, intermediates, but also you need to have complete traceability if you've used any contract manufacturers, labellers or relabellers, packers, if you've used any external analytical laboratories and so on. So you will need this full traceability, really identifying all of the products, all the starting materials, excipients, APIs that have gone into your product, and all of the services of any third parties that you might have used. And you need to have confirmation that you know exactly where everything has been sourced with respect to your active substances as well. Now really this is just good traceability, but we will need to be able to demonstrate that. We will need to be able to tie all of that together. And although the Chapter 5 doesn't actually use the word pedigree for this traceability through the supply chain, effectively that was the word that was being used last week. In terms of forthcoming changes, it's interesting to note that EMA and the Pharmaceutical Inspection Cooperation Scheme now have a formal agreement to collaborate and to align their GMP guidance. The reality is that's been happening for a number of years, but that's now a formal objective, there's a formal agreement in place. We do know that there will be some changes coming along. So the first of all is going to be a risk assessment guideline for the use of excipients. So we're not going to see guidelines on how you should be and what you should be doing with your excipients and your excipient suppliers. But as a manufacturer, on the basis of risk, you should decide what are appropriate standards of good manufacturing practice for your excipients, and you will be responsible for making sure that your suppliers are complying with suitable good manufacturing practice for those excipients. And there will be guidelines on how to do that. It's also going to be looking at the topic of dedicated facilities. Most of you will know that the existing guidance on dedicated facilities identifies a number of products or processes that must have dedicated facilities. And that's very specific and quite honestly often without a sound scientific basis. So we're looking to produce additional guidance in Chapter 3 and Chapter 5 on how to use a science-based approach to decide when you need dedicated facilities, some sort of tool to help look at toxicology, and really this is to help recognise the fact that we are moving more towards contained manufacturing and contained facilities. A while ago when I reviewed the ISPE Biopharmaceutical Facilities Guide, there was a much greater emphasis on containment rather than dedicated facilities. Also, I'll be looking at, in the future, Chapter 6, Quality Control. That's expected early next year, and really is going to look at how we can perhaps streamline the transfer of analytical methods and so on between different facilities. We're looking at Chapter 8 on complaints and product recall. And again, that's really just to try and introduce a quality risk-based approach into those concepts and those processes. Again, we expect to see that early next year. And Annex 15 on validation is going to be updated to be much more consistent with ICH Q8 to Q11. And we're going to see some a consultation document or that draft. Again, that's going to come out early next year. So really everybody who's involved in GMP needs to be aware that some of these things are coming out next year or coming out for consultation next year. Also going to provide some update and a public consultation on parametric or real-time release. The Committee on Medicinal Products for Use in Humans released some guidance last year on parametrical real-time release. That's starting to be used more by some organisations. So we're going to see, certainly at the European level, public consultation in terms of what new guidance on that topic might look like. So again, some more consultation going on. These things here, they are not definitely going to be looked at. They're just possibilities. One is to look at additional guidance on how water for injection can be produced, possibly looking at accepting the use of making RFI by reverse osmosis, but also control of biofilms in manufacturing processes, which some companies, some plants had issues with. And we've talked a lot about the importation of product, and it's possible that we'll see new guidance to clarify further those regulatory requirements. Other trends from EMA, continuing focus, trying to work together with the industry on addressing issues of drug shortages. Obviously, as we're tightening up on the regulatory front, in some cases that is making it more difficult to source APIs, and certainly a big ongoing move for further international collaboration. So certainly through PICS, which now includes US FDA, ICH and so on, we expect to see much more international collaboration, which if it won't formally extend some of the mutual recognition agreements that exist, we are going to see much more of a reliance on confidentiality agreements for regulators to be able to transfer information about organisations. Okay, so spend a little bit of time here on looking at the implications of the Falsified Medicines Directive and the Drugs Supply Chain Security Act in the US, and what that means in terms of product serialization and deadlines. So as I mentioned earlier, President Obama signed into law the HR 3204, which looks at drug compounding and specifically the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. So what that has done, first of all, is kicked into the long grass the pending requirements that California was looking to enact in very short measure. I don't think this will be a particular surprise, certainly to anybody in California. This HR 3204 has been on the cards for the last 9 or 10 months, going through various political processes. But basically, any requirements that California had in place, any deadlines that they had put in place are dead, are gone, and basically any other US state now will no longer be able to put in place their own legislation in this area. So that's helped clarify the situation in terms of which regulations will apply and what some of the timescales are. I do think, quite honestly, I mentioned last time, California had done an excellent job in terms of focusing debate on the practicalities of serialisation, but also electronic pedigrees. And I do believe that will feed into the process we'll talk about in a moment. So we have those outline requirements, we have those deadlines, and it's interesting when we compare those against the deadlines and requirements that come out of the EU Falsified Medicines Directive, because the dates are very similar. There is certainly the opportunity to align some of the technical requirements in 2014, and there are still different requirements and different dates in some areas, but I do think that we have an opportunity here, as we've already seen on the medical devices side with the collaborative global efforts on unique device identifiers. I think there is an opportunity here to get some clarification and consistency, certainly between the US and Europe. So 2014 is going to be a key year for additional lawmaking in both Europe and the US. In Europe, we have some so-called delegated acts which have to be developed. So the Falsified Medicines Directive requires that these acts are drawn up in 2014, and these address really two main areas. First of all is the technical standards by which we will be applying the unique identifiers to our consumer level packaging. So that is, what the data carrier will be. I think most people expect that will be 2D data matrix. Certainly have an option that the data that will be encoded there will almost certainly be one of the ISO standards, such as required for Turkey, for instance. Those delegated acts will also identify how partners in the supply chain, potentially, but certainly how retail pharmacies and hospital pharmacies will be able to verify, uniquely identified product when it's received. And that includes the use of the European Medicines Verification System. So I think we mentioned last time that's essentially going to be a big database. That's going in the Microsoft cloud, and that's where all of this serialized data will have to be submitted, and that's the database against which the retail pharmacies will be enabled to check that their product that they're received, that they're dispensing, is a valid product and isn't counterfeit. The other thing that has to be clarified in Europe is the scope of medicines which have to be included. Now, at a high level, very simple levels, ethical drugs, prescription drugs will have to be serialized, and over-the-counter drugs will not be serialized. But that is at a high level. The European Union will be looking at any necessary exceptions there. So it might be that they choose that certain over-the-counter medications might have to be serialized, and they might provide a way that to other types of prescription pharmaceuticals, for instance. So through 2014, we will see the European Union coming out and consulting on those items. And a similar process is going to be happening in the US. Now, it's slightly different in the US because as well as putting identifiers on both the primary, i.e. consumer level packaging, but also the secondary level packaging, so the case or the carton, depending on the terminology. And it pretty much looks like the US is going for 2D data matrix, certainly on the primary packaging, possibly still linear barcode on the case or carton. But as well as that, they are going to basically standardise on pedigree. Now, what the pedigree is basically the information that gets passed down the distribution chain, which includes information in terms of the transaction information, the transaction history, and a statement that the supply chain partner received the product from another registered supply chain partner, and so on. Initially, this will be able to be done on paper or electronic format. Most companies, I think, will have to go for paper because this has to be in place by the beginning of 2015. And FDA, again, are required to put a public docket out for consultation. But again, they are required by the Drug Supply Chain Security Act to consider the use of, open international standards such as ISO. So there really is the opportunity for Europe and the US to standardise through these consultation processes on the same types of data carriers, the same data formats and so on, which will make life so much easier for drug manufacturers. Now, there's a requirement for both of these organisations to be pragmatic. So in drawing up these delegated acts, the European Commission has to consider, as you can see there, the benefits, but also the costs and the cost effectiveness of what they're proposing. And also the particular characteristics of the supply chains in different member states. So it's no good coming up with a technical solution that will work for 90% of the supply chain that's distributed through big wholesale distributors. It has to work for everybody, recognising that some European countries don't have the infrastructure that that others do, recognising that, some markets, the German, the French, the UK pharmaceutical market is much larger than some of the new member states. In the US, the FDA has to consult with other federal agencies, but also they have to consult through its public docket process with manufacturers, distributors, supply chain stakeholders and so on. And they have to consider the diversity of the pharmaceutical distribution supply chain and provide flexibility for each sector, including both large and small businesses. So that's next year. By November 2015, they also have to publish guidance on any waivers. So the Drugs Supply Chain Security Act does include provision to exempt certain organisations from these requirements, either based upon the size of the organisation or the potential for economic hardship, for instance. And they also have to provide guidance on grandfathering. So on the date that these requirements come into force, there will be products already in the distribution chain that don't have a pedigree with them and that don't have a serial number on them. So they have to provide guidance on how that grandfathered product will be handled in the supply chain. Now, if you look at the dates, in Europe, these technical requirements have to be in place and will be enforced 36 months after the delegated acts are in place. We expect those delegated acts to be finalised late next year. So you add 3 months to that. We get late 2017. And in the US, the 21st of November 2017, so 4 years after passing the Act, is the deadline there. And by that date, organisations will have to be moving off paper, so their transaction information, transaction histories and statements must be in electronic format. Now that can be through the use of a database which is provided either by the manufacturer or by databases which can be provided by commercial third parties. So whereas in Europe there will be a single database provided by essentially the regulators, by governments, in the US they're taking more of a free market approach. There will be one or more commercial databases where you will submit your transaction information. So in the US, by 2023, everything must have gone fully electronic. Now, there are various other dates between 2015 and 2023, but it's quite complex depending on whether you're a manufacturer, whether you're a wholesaler, whether you're a repacker, and so on, which dates apply when. But the details are in the Act, if anybody's interested in taking a look. So in terms of short-term considerations, the first thing to do is to make sure that both the European Union, because those requirements exist now, and from next to end of next year for the US, so going into 2015, that you have a verified supply chain, that you know that anybody you are buying product from, and in a number of cases anybody you're providing product to, is actually registered within Europe or within the US in accordance with the requirements of either the Falsified Medicines Directive or the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. Now, as I say, that's a requirement for Europe now. That's something people need to start looking at. It's something that comes in relatively quickly for the US. You also need to be putting appropriate processes in place to establish appropriate paperwork for, in quotes, pedigree. Now, look, in the EU, we've had requirements for a delivery note to go into every shipment, even in the old GDP guidance. That really hasn't changed significantly. And the information that needs to go on that delivery note is much less. And that doesn't have to be passed down the supply chain, whereas in the US, you have to provide this exchange of transaction information and transaction history down the supply chain. The difference in Europe and the US will be, we're focusing on public health in Europe. We're providing pharmacies with the ability to verify that the product they are dispensing is authentic, whereas in the US they are making provision for distributors to be able to authenticate product, but also be responsible for any subversion in the supply chain that does take place. And again, the paperwork has to be in place by the end of next year for that. And that's something that anybody exporting to the US from Europe needs to be aware of. In terms of medium term, we're going to obviously have to be able to generate, transact and exchange these serial numbers. Again, there are existing requirements for some markets. Turkey is the one that's often cited. And before we get to 2017, so as early as 2015, there are other markets such as China who will require this unique identification of products. There's also potential, as we saw last time, for companies like Argentina, Brazil, and so on, to introduce these requirements relatively quickly. So manufacturers need to start to look at solutions and think about how they're going to acquire solutions to support these requirements for serialisation pedigree. Now, obviously, we don't know what the technical standards will be until we have these delegated acts and until the FDA produce new regulations in the US, and that's going to be the end of 2014. But the reality is, if we wait until the end of 2014, beginning of 2015, you might not be able to meet the requirements for countries like Turkey and China, and you may be leaving it pretty late to fully integrate those systems with the databases, with the regulators, with the other systems as well. Now, perhaps the easiest way to generate these delivery notes and to provide these paper pedigrees moving forward is actually to put a system in place next year so that by the end of 2014 you can generate the paperwork that's necessary. And certainly for the US market, that is going to be more than just a simple delivery note. That's going to have to contain quite complex information. Now, the good thing is that the good software vendors have been keeping track of these regulations for a number of years. So if you choose the right product next year and implement that, you'll be able to meet some of the 2015 requirements to generate that paper cost effectively. But it's guaranteed pretty much that the systems that you will buy, if you buy them from the reputable vendors, you will be able to meet the regulatory requirements as those are further defined next year. The concern would be if companies only start to look for these systems at the end of next year as these technical requirements are being finalised. The problem is going to be everybody will want one. And through 2015 to 2016, there is a concern in the industry there's going to be a shortage of resources to implement these systems. And historically, it seems as if people are underestimating the time that it takes to acquire and implement these systems, and more importantly, integrate them with your other business systems, with the regulatory databases, and with your supply chain partners. So it's certainly something to be looking at now, and if you haven't already got a project in place, you need to be thinking about that. So let's wrap all that up and think about implications on enterprise systems. And the reason we do that is obviously because most of the recipients' customer base are working with us around their enterprise systems. So we've talked about the requirements to verify that your distributors, that your suppliers are established in these databases, they are authorised and so on. Now, that's not a massive change, but you will pretty much have to make sure that your approved supplier list process or your customer order acceptance process goes through this step of verifying that your supply chain partners are authorised, either that they're on these databases or that they are able to demonstrate they're otherwise authorised over the next couple of years. Now, that's probably not going to make a big change to your business process, but one thing you would need to think about is actually how and where you're going to capture that evidence that you've verified your supply chain partners. It might be as simple as just, taking a copy of a certificate or an entry in the database and adding an extra field to your approved supply list to confirm that you verified that. You might want to attach a document to your approved supply list and so I think another change we're going to see is certainly a number of probably smaller distributors are going to be putting much more focus on the validation of their enterprise systems. Again, a lot of organisations are using inventory management systems, ERP, warehouse management systems, barcode scanners and so on, to manage the movement of products. And again, if we're going to be using those to track products or to segregate product by status, clear guidance now from the regulators that those systems need to be validated. The big distributors have already done that. Even the big logistics providers and transportation companies have already done that. But certainly small to medium-sized distributors, or potentially small to medium-sized specialist manufacturers who are also distributing, may need to look at that, or potentially extending the scope of the validation of some of their GMP systems. These requirements for pedigree, so this traceability into a batch of all of the product, starting materials, excipients, APIs, and you know, the providers of services that have gone into that batch, might mean we need to extend our view of lot or batch genealogy. Essentially, you need to be able to pull all this information together so that you know exactly, you know, how do you assure the quality of a batch of pharmaceuticals you're releasing. And it may be that you want to extend that view of genealogy within your enterprise systems. So an example there might be, as well as a batch record showing the starting material that went into a batch, you might want to link that electronically, obviously to the lot number of the API, which you will be required to know under API GMP, but also link that to the supplier, and that in turn, of course, is linked to your verification of that supplier. So you've got a much more robust and holistic assurance there when somebody's releasing a batch, that everything that has gone into that, every product, every material, the services of every supplier have appropriate quality. And as we mentioned, there's obviously a need to look at computerized systems for serialization and pedigree. And again, you need to think about the deadlines there and how long it's actually going to take to implement those systems. So we'll wrap up, and yes, we've got 5 minutes or so for questions, which is great. So in conclusion, there have been some significant changes in certainly European good distribution practice in recent months, and effectively that's what we're seeing in the US as well, through the Drugs Supply Chain Security Act as well. This not only impacts upon distributors, but potentially manufacturers, most of whom, of course, are also distributors, but importers, exporters, and brokers as well. So you need to understand your piece in that whole puzzle and what applies to you. There have been a number of changes to European Union GMP, and as we saw, there are quite a few that are planned for next year. You need to keep an eye on those, and potentially things coming down a little bit later as well. And as we've seen, the Drugs Supply Chain Security Act is going to bring additional changes if you're selling into the US. But I really hope that regulators, in the spirit of international harmonisation, do take the opportunity next year to talk to each other, to involve each other, and see how we can align these requirements under the delegated acts, under the Falsified Medicines Directive and the Drugs Supply Chain Security Act. As a regulated company, obviously, where there have already been changes to regulations, you need to comply with those. So certainly you need to review your business processes, see if anything needs to be changed there. Again, that's going to be, I think, fine-tuning rather than whole-scale changes in the short term. Potentially, you might want to look at the way your computerized systems are set up, and also the scope of your validation, where those systems touch upon GDP, if those have not already been validated. So a few things to think about there. Right, before we look at the questions, some of you might be interested that we're going to be looking at a couple of different topics over the next couple of months. Next month we're going to be looking at digital signatures. I think we're aware that smaller organisations or small teams within organisations get very frustrated by still signing documents by hand. I know that as a supplier organisation, a number of our clients require us to sign documents by hand, and we print them and scan them and email them and fax them and send them through the post, and that takes time and adds cost. So we'll actually be looking at some cost-effective digital signature technology. It's not rocket science, the technology's out there. So we'll be looking at how perhaps your organisation might be able to leverage that without massive investment. And then we're going to look at the cloud in February. I'm trying to sweet talk a couple of cloud service providers to share some of what they're doing, because GMP significant applications are now being made available as software as a service in the cloud. And to be honest, some of these cloud service providers are doing a very good job considering the regulatory implications and the need to validate these systems. I've been talking recently to adverse events reporting software providers and also auditing database providers who are making some very good software available in the cloud. Right, we've got a few minutes to look at some questions. My watch is telling me we've got three minutes, so we'll try and run through them. Got some questions on transportation. Is there a minimum time for transporting a product during which these verification of temperature controls doesn't apply? I think the answer to that is no, from what we heard last week. It doesn't matter how short the period during which you are transporting products. It needs to be maintained within those defined temperature limits. And somebody asked a question about, does this just apply to refrigerated products or ambient products? So products that need to be stored in ambient conditions. It does apply to ambient as well. Ambient temperature is different in different parts of the world. I'm going to Japan in a couple of years' time, nothing to do with work. We're taking a lot of young people, and one of the things we have to consider is that drugs that they may purchase in the UK will be outside their storage temperature limits when we're in Japan in the summer. So you need to think about ambient as well. Somebody said, I thought we had 10 years to comply with the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. That's for the full database to be in effect and for the paper processes to go away. So we will need to start looking at things electronically in 2017. Somebody asked how they can get on board with these MHRA symposiums. Well worth going along to. Very good last week. So go to the MHRA website. You can register for email updates, and you will get the emails when they're organising the next one. They have them every year. And somebody asked a question about MHRA submitting your annual registration or new registration electronically. Yes, MHRA are trialling it in the system. At the moment, when you send your paper forms off, they are actually entering the data through their new web interface. They're using that to test that. And I think it's early next year you will be able to put your new registrations, your annual updates through the website rather than sending paper. Right, I think we've got to all the questions there. If anyone's got any other questions that occur to them, you can get in touch. You can see my email address there. We will be blogging on this subject about supply chain security over the coming week or so. Thank you very much for your time today. We do appreciate you've got other things to do. I'm going collecting for charity tonight with Father Christmas. For those who can't come, I wish you a happy holidays, and hopefully we'll speak again in January. Goodbye.